In 15 years, I knocked with a practiced smile, selling paradise, until an 8-year-old boy died because faith outranked life. They tried to silence me, branded me apostate, shattered my world. But the secret that broke me and exposed what happens behind closed doors will be revealed here. What I learned that day changes everything for good. I thought I was serving God. Every morning before dawn, I'd slip into my modest navy suit, grab my leather satchel filled with The Watchtower and Awake magazines, and walk the dusty streets of our small Tennessee town. Door after door, with that practiced smile I'd perfected over 15 years, I'd say, "Good morning, I have wonderful news about God's kingdom." Most folks would glance at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, but I believed I was special, one of the chosen ones. My name is Mary Ellen Hartwell, and I was a pioneer for Jehovah's Witnesses. Hello, my dear friends. I'm 68 years old now, and I'm sharing this story from my little kitchen table here in Nashville, where the morning light streams through gingham curtains my late mother sewed for me decades ago. If you're watching this, please let me know in the comments where you're from. I love knowing my voice is reaching kind souls across the country. And if this story touches your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It means the world to this old lady to know she's not speaking into the void. The story I'm about to tell happened when I was 42 years old, back in 1987. It's a story I kept buried for over 30 years, locked away in the deepest corners of my heart because the truth was too painful to speak. But silence, I've learned, can be more dangerous than the most uncomfortable truth. In our congregation, we were taught to distrust everything and everyone outside our walls. The world was ending any day now, they said, and only those who obeyed without question would survive to see paradise. We lived in constant expectation of Armageddon, constantly watching for signs, constantly proving our worthiness through hours of door-to-door service, through perfect attendance at meetings, through unwavering loyalty to the organization. My husband Tom and I had been faithful members for 15 years. We'd met at a circuit assembly when I was just 20, both of us young and eager to serve Jehovah. Tom worked at the local lumber mill, steady work, honest work, and I spent my days in full-time pioneering, dedicating 60 hours a month to spreading what we believed was the only truth that could save mankind. Our little white house on Maple Street smelled perpetually of coffee and the lavender soap I made from scratch. Every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, I'd hear the familiar crunch of gravel in our driveway as Sister Ruth pulled up in her faded blue Buick for our weekly planning meeting. We'd sit at my kitchen table, the same table where I'm recording this now, spreading out territory maps and counting magazines, planning our routes through town like generals preparing for a holy war. "Mary Ellen," Sister Ruth would say, her gray eyes intense behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Remember, we're not just selling magazines. We're offering people their only chance at eternal life." Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and I absorbed them like a dry sponge absorbs water. The congregation was our entire world. 3 meetings a week, Tuesday night book study, Thursday night theocratic ministry school, and Sunday morning watchtower study, plus Saturday morning field service. Our calendar revolved around these gatherings at the Kingdom Hall, a modest brick building on the outskirts of town, where folding chairs faced a simple platform adorned only with the words, "God's Kingdom," painted in blue letters. Brother Robert. Mason was our presiding overseer, a tall man with silver hair and hands that moved when he spoke, emphasizing every point with the authority of someone who never doubted his own righteousness. His wife, Sister Diane, taught the women's Bible studies, her voice soft but firm as she reminded us that our greatest honor was quiet submission to God's arrangement. I remember the smell of the Kingdom Hall, industrial carpet cleaner mixed with the faint scent of the cheap coffee we served after meetings. I remember the sound of children fidgeting during long talks about prophecy and doctrine. I remember feeling so grateful to be part of God's chosen people, so thankful to have found the truth in a world full of lies. But most of all, I remember the Sunday morning in October 1987 when Sister Sarah Bennett arrived at the Kingdom Hall, with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling voice that would shatter everything I believed about our loving organization. She sat 3 rows ahead of me, her usually perfect auburn hair slightly disheveled, her hand shaking as she clutched a crumpled tissue. During the opening song, I noticed she wasn't singing. During the prayer, I saw her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Something was terribly wrong, but none of us dared ask during the meeting. In our organization, questions were discouraged unless they came from the elders. After the closing prayer, as we filed out into the crisp autumn air, I approached Sarah hesitantly. We'd been friends for years. She'd been the one to bring me into the truth, actually, knocking on my door that first time with such gentle confidence that I couldn't help but listen. "Sarah," I whispered, touching her elbow gently. "Are you all right?" She looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold an ocean of pain, and for a moment I thought she might speak. Instead, she shook her head and hurried to her car, leaving me standing in the parking lot with a strange knot forming in my stomach. That knot would grow over the coming weeks, fed by hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, by meaningful glances exchanged between the elders, by the careful way people began to speak around certain subjects. Something had happened to Sarah's family, something that made the adults whisper and the children ask questions that weren't answered. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when I found Sarah weeping in the empty Kingdom Hall after a meeting, that I learned the truth that would change everything. "My little boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the echoing silence. "My little Eli." I knelt beside Sarah in that empty Kingdom Hall, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like mechanical prayers. The smell of industrial carpet and stale coffee seemed heavier in the silence, pressing down on us as she struggled to speak through her tears. "Eli was only 8, she whispered, her voice cracking on his name. "Just 8 years old, Mary Ellen. He loved building model airplanes, you know? Those little plastic ones with tiny parts everywhere. Every Sunday after the meeting, he'd ask if we could stop at the hobby store to look at new kits." Sarah Bennett had been in the truth for 12 years, longer than me. She'd grown up in a Baptist household in Kentucky, married young to a man who drank too much and hit too often. When the witnesses came to her door in 1975, she saw them as her salvation, a chance to start over with people who preached love and protection. Her husband left when she got baptized, calling her a fanatic, but Sarah said she felt freer than she'd ever been. She was the kind of woman our organization held up as an example. Never missed a meeting, always had her watchtower prepared with neat underlines and notes in the margins. She pioneered part-time while working as a seamstress, often staying up late to hem wedding dresses and mend children's clothes to support herself and Eli. Her small apartment above the fabric shop on Main Street always smelled like vanilla candles. And the roses she grew in coffee cans on her fire escape. "The accident happened on a Tuesday," she continued, her hands twisting the tissue until it fell apart. "Eli was riding his bike to school. You know that steep hill behind the elementary. School, his brakes failed. He hit the guardrail going so fast." I remembered that Tuesday. I'd been out in field service with Sister Ruth, working the neighborhoods near the school. We'd heard the ambulance sirens around 8:30 in the morning, seen the flashing lights, but thought nothing of it. Small towns have accidents. People get hurt. Life goes on. The doctor said he needed blood immediately. Sarah's voice dropped to almost nothing. Internal bleeding, they called it. They explained how his body was shutting down, how a transfusion could save him. They begged me, Mary Ellen. This one doctor, Dr. Martinez, I think, he had tears in his eyes when he looked at Eli lying there so pale, so still. Brother Robert Mason had arrived at the hospital within an hour of the accident. Sarah told me how he'd swept into the intensive care unit with 2 other elders, Brother David Clark and Brother Michael Torres, their faces grave but determined. They'd gathered around Sarah's chair outside Eli's room like protective shields, she said, reminding her of God's law about blood. Brother Robert held my hands and quoted scripture, Sarah remembered. Acts 15:29, abstain from blood. He said Jehovah was testing my faith, that if I truly loved Eli, I'd protect his chance for resurrection by keeping him clean before God. I'd known Brother Robert for years. He was a man in his late 50s, who worked as an insurance adjuster, methodical and precise in everything he did. His wife, Martha, kept an immaculate house where the elders' wives gathered monthly for what they called encouragement meetings, really sessions where we shared stories about staying strong in the face of worldly pressure. Brother Robert spoke, often about the importance of loyalty, about how the world would try to make us compromise our principles with emotional manipulation. The hospital called in social services. They might have to get a court order to save Eli's life. But Brother Robert, he talked to them. He brought legal documents, papers about religious freedom, contact information for the organization's lawyers. Everything was so organized. Mary Ellen, like they'd done this before. The image of those three men in their neat suits, standing in a hospital hallway while a child bled to death in the next room, made something twist in my stomach. I'd always admired their steadfast commitment to principle, their refusal to compromise God's standards for any reason. But sitting there with Sarah, hearing the grief in her voice, those same qualities felt different somehow. Dr. Martinez kept trying, she whispered. He brought other doctors to talk to me. They showed me pictures of children who'd received transfusions and recovered completely. They explained alternatives that might work but were much riskier. One nurse, she was probably about my age, she sat with me and said, "Mrs. Bennett, I'm a mother too. Please, let us save your son." But the elders had stayed with Sarah through the entire ordeal. When she wavered, they reminded her of the faithful Hebrews who chose the fiery furnace rather than bow to the king's image. When she asked if there might be alternative treatments, they gently explained that some treatments contained blood fractions that could compromise her son's purity before God. When the doctors grew more urgent, Brother Robert stepped forward to handle the discussions, shielding Sarah from what he called worldly pressure tactics. Eli died at 11:47 on Thursday night, Sarah said, and the finality in her voice made the empty Kingdom Hall feel like a tomb. I was holding his little hand. He looked so peaceful, Mary Ellen, like he was just sleeping. The doctors kept working, trying everything else they could, but... She trailed off, staring at the platform where Brother Robert would give his next talk in just 3 days, probably about the importance of faithfulness under trial. The funeral was beautiful, she added quietly. Brother Robert gave the talk. He said Eli died faithful to Jehovah, that his integrity under trial was an example to us all. Everyone said how proud I should be, how I'd pass the test, how I'd have the wonderful hope of seeing Eli again in paradise. I wanted to comfort her, to say something about God's plan or the resurrection hope, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just sat there in that fluorescent-lit silence, listening to Sarah's quiet breathing and feeling something fundamental shift inside my chest. "Mary Ellen," she said finally, turning to look at me with eyes that seemed much older than her 35 years. "Do you think God really wanted me to let my little boy die?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge to everything we'd been taught, everything we'd believed, everything we'd built our lives around. And for the first time in 15 years, as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I didn't have an answer. Sarah's question echoed in my mind for days after that conversation in the empty Kingdom Hall. "Do you think God really wanted me to let my little boy die?" I found myself turning it over like a smooth stone in my pocket, examining it from every angle during my morning coffee, while folding laundry, during the long silences that had started creeping into my conversations with Tom. The following Sunday, Brother Robert gave a talk about loyalty to God's standards. He stood at the podium with his usual confidence, his silver hair catching the light as he gestured toward the congregation. Sometimes, dear brothers and sisters, Jehovah asks us to do difficult things. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac. The 3 Hebrew young men chose the fiery furnace. And today, faithful Christians still choose obedience to God over the temporary concerns of this dying world. I watched the congregation nod in unison, their faces reflecting the same certainty I'd worn for 15 years. But Sarah sat 2 rows ahead of me, perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like she was carved from stone. She didn't nod. She didn't take notes. She just stared at Brother Robert with an expression I couldn't quite read. After the meeting, I noticed how people interacted with Sarah. The hugs lasted a little longer, the voices carried a slightly forced brightness, and conversation seemed to hover around everything except her son. Sister Martha Mason approached her with a casserole, dish and a gentle smile. "We're all so proud of your faithfulness, dear," Sister Martha said, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for the spiritually exemplary. "Your courage is an inspiration to the young mothers in our congregation." Sarah accepted the casserole with a quiet "thank you," but I saw something flicker across her face, a micro-expression that was there and gone so quickly I almost missed it. It looked like confusion, maybe even anger, but it was swept away so fast by her polite smile that I wondered if I'd imagined it. That week, I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. During Tuesday night book study at the Clark's house, when Brother David read about the faithful servants who obeyed God rather than men, I found myself studying the faces around the circle. Everyone nodded approvingly when he emphasized how true Christians must be willing to sacrifice everything for their beliefs. But what struck me was how abstract it all seemed. Sacrifice as a concept, faithfulness as a principle, obedience as a virtue divorced from real faces, real children, real grief. On Thursday evening at the Kingdom Hall, Sister Ruth and I sat together during the Theocratic Ministry School. A young brother named Timothy was giving a talk about the evils of blood transfusions, reading statistics about complications and infections, quoting medical journals about alternative treatments. His delivery was smooth, practiced, convincing. The audience listened with rapt attention as he painted blood transfusions as not only spiritually dangerous, but medically questionable. "Even worldly doctors are beginning to recognize," Timothy said, adjusting his tie with nervous precision, "that bloodless surgery often produces better outcomes for patients. Jehovah's wisdom in protecting his people from blood contamination becomes more apparent with each passing year." I glanced at Sarah, who was taking notes with mechanical precision. Her handwriting, usually so neat, looked shaky. After the meeting, I lingered in the parking lot, hoping to catch her alone, but Brother Robert appeared at her elbow with his warm pastoral smile. "Sister Bennett," he said, placing a fatherly hand on her shoulder, "I wanted you to know how encouraged I was by your attentiveness tonight. It shows remarkable spiritual maturity to continue growing in knowledge even during times of trial." Sarah nodded politely, but I noticed she stepped slightly away from his touch. "Thank you, Brother Robert. I'm just trying to understand everything better." "Of course," he replied, his tone carrying that gentle authority that made disagreement seem almost disrespectful. "If you have any questions, remember that the faithful and discreet slave class provides all the spiritual food we need. We don't want to confuse ourselves by looking to worldly sources for answers to spiritual matters." That phrase, worldly sources, had been coming up more frequently in recent talks. Any information that didn't originate from the Watchtower organization was automatically suspect, potentially dangerous, certainly unnecessary. We were encouraged to trust completely in the spiritual food provided through official channels, to see any desire for additional information as a sign of spiritual weakness or pride. The next Saturday morning during field service, I was paired with Sister Linda Morgan, a woman in her early 40s who'd been baptized the same year as me. We were working a neighborhood of small houses near the Tennessee River, the kind of area where people hung laundry on lines and children played barefoot in dirt yards. At our third house, a woman in her 60s invited us onto her front porch. She listened politely as Linda explained our message about God's kingdom, nodding occasionally and asking thoughtful questions. When Linda mentioned our beliefs about blood transfusions, the woman's expression changed. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But I lost my husband to cancer 5 years ago. Blood transfusions bought us 6 more months together. 6 months to say goodbye, to make peace, to tell our grandchildren how much their grandpa loved them. I can't understand a God who would forbid something that gives families more time to love each other." Linda responded with our standard explanation about eternal life versus temporary life, about trusting in God's wisdom even when we don't understand, about the wonderful hope of resurrection. But the woman just shook her head, sadly. "Honey," she said, looking directly at me, "I've been going to church for 63 years. I've read my Bible cover to cover more times than I can count, and I've never found anywhere that Jesus turned away sick people because helping them might be complicated. He healed everyone who came to him, no exceptions, no conditions, no rule books." On the drive back to the Kingdom Hall, Linda expressed concern about what she called worldly reasoning and emotional manipulation. She explained how Satan often uses people's natural feelings to make wrong choices seem reasonable, how the world's definition of love differs from God's perfect love. But I found myself thinking about that woman's words, about Jesus healing everyone who came to him. I'd read those stories hundreds of times, but I'd never considered them in light of our blood doctrine. In my mind, I began to review every healing account I could remember who touched Jesus' garment. The man lowered through the roof by his friends, the centurion's servant, the blind man who received sight. Had Jesus ever asked any of them to refuse medical treatment? Had he ever suggested that following him might require letting loved ones die? The following Tuesday, I did something I'd never done before. After Tom went to bed, I pulled out my Bible and started reading the healing accounts with fresh eyes. Not looking for ways to support our teachings, not seeking confirmation of what I already believed, but simply reading the stories as if I'd never heard them before. What I found disturbed me profoundly. Jesus seemed to approach suffering with an urgency to relieve it, not a willingness to allow it for the sake of principle. When people brought their sick children to him, he healed them immediately. When parents begged for their children's lives, he didn't ask them to prove their faith by accepting the children's deaths. I started making notes in a small notebook I kept hidden in my dresser drawer. Questions I couldn't ask aloud, observations that didn't fit with our teachings, Bible verses that seemed to contradict the organization's positions. It felt dangerous and liberating at the same time, like I was finally using my mind for something other than confirming predetermined conclusions. Over the next several weeks, I began to notice cracks in what had once seemed like perfect spiritual unity. During field service, I heard brothers and sisters giving slightly different explanations for the same doctrines. At meetings, I watched people's faces during talks about controversial topics like blood transfusions, disfellowshipping, and the organization's authority. Most maintained expressions of perfect agreement, but occasionally I caught glimpses of doubt, confusion, or discomfort, quickly suppressed. One evening after the book study, I overheard part of a conversation between Brother David Clark and Brother Michael Torres. They were standing in the Kingdom Hall parking lot, their voices low but carried by the still night air. "The family is asking too many questions," Brother David was saying. "They want to know why the boy couldn't have received synthetic blood, expanders, why the elders didn't discuss alternative treatments with the doctors." "Brother Robert handled it correctly," Michael replied. "The mother made the right choice. Now she needs to focus on the hope of resurrection rather than second-guessing faithful decisions." "I know. But the father, he wasn't baptized, you know. He's been talking to people in town, asking questions about our beliefs, suggesting we pressured his ex-wife into letting their son die." My blood ran cold. They were talking about Sarah and Eli. Sarah's ex-husband, who'd left when she joined the organization, was apparently raising questions about his son's death. And the elders were discussing it like a public relations problem rather than a family tragedy. The next morning, I called Sarah's apartment above the fabric shop. The phone rang 6 times before she answered, her voice flat and distant. "Sarah, it's Mary Ellen. I was wondering if you'd like some company today. Maybe we could have lunch together." There was a long pause. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mary Ellen. Brother Robert suggested I might need some time to focus on my relationship with Jehovah without distractions." Distractions? The word came out sharper than I intended. Another pause. "He said sometimes when we're grieving, we can become vulnerable to negative thinking, that it's better to lean on the organization's guidance rather than on friendships that might complicate our healing process." I hung up the phone feeling like I'd been slapped. Sarah was being isolated, cut off from friendships that might encourage her to ask uncomfortable questions. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Our loving organization was protecting itself by silencing a grieving mother. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started keeping a detailed journal of conversations, meetings, and incidents I witnessed. Not to use against anyone, I told myself, but simply to have a record of what was really happening behind the facade of spiritual unity and love. I had no idea that within 6 months, that journal would become evidence in a battle that would cost me everything I thought I valued, but would ultimately give me something I'd never had before: the freedom to follow my conscience wherever it led. The breaking point came on a cold February morning in 1988, 4 months after Eli's death. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I'm recording this story now, reading the latest Watchtower magazine when I found an article that made my hands shake. The article was titled, "Maintaining Loyalty in Tests of Faith," and it told the story of a faithful mother who had allowed her child to die rather than accept a blood transfusion. The child wasn't named, but the details were unmistakable. An 8-year-old boy, a bicycle accident, a mother who courageously upheld God's standards despite intense pressure from medical personnel and unbelieving family members. They had turned Eli's death into a teaching example. Sarah wasn't mentioned by name, but anyone in our congregation would recognize the story. The article praised the mother's exemplary faith and used her choice as proof of how Jehovah's people maintain integrity even under the most difficult circumstances. It encouraged other parents to follow her example of putting spiritual welfare above temporary physical concerns. I read the article 3 times, each reading making me angrier than the last. They had reduced a mother's agony, a child's death, a family's destruction to a convenient illustration for a magazine article. Eli wasn't a person to them. He was propaganda. I grabbed my coat and drove straight to the fabric shop where Sarah worked. I found her in the back room, hunched over a sewing machine, her movements mechanical and lifeless. When I knocked on the doorframe, she looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged years in just a few months. "Sarah," I said, holding up the magazine, "have you seen this?" She glanced at the watchtower in my hands and nodded slowly. "Brother Robert brought it by yesterday. He said it was an honor that my experience could help strengthen other families' faith." An honor? The word exploded out of me louder than I intended. "They turned your little boy's death into a magazine article." Sarah's hands stilled on the fabric. For a long moment, the only sound was the humming of the sewing machine's motor. Then, quietly, she said, "Mary Ellen, you need to be careful. Brother Robert warned me that some people might try to turn my grief into bitterness against the organization. Is that what you think I'm doing?" She looked at me with an expression so tired, so defeated, that it broke my heart. "I don't know what to think anymore. All I know is that my son is dead, and I have to believe it meant something. If I don't believe that, then what was it all for?" I knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in mine. "Sarah, what if it didn't have to mean anything? What if it was just a terrible tragedy that could have been prevented?" She pulled her hands away, her voice rising with something that might have been panic. "Don't say that. Please don't say that. If you're right, then I killed my own child. For nothing. If you're right, then everything we've believed, everything we've sacrificed, everything we've built our lives around is a lie." "Maybe it is," I whispered. The words hung in the air between us like a confession, like a betrayal, like the most dangerous truth either of us had ever spoken aloud. Sarah stood up abruptly, backing away from me. "You need to leave, Mary Ellen. You need to leave right now." But I couldn't leave, not yet. "Sarah, I've been reading the Bible without the organization's literature, just reading it on its own. Jesus never asked anyone to let their children die. He never turned away sick people, because helping them might violate some religious law. He healed on the Sabbath even when the religious leaders condemned him for it." "Stop it," she said, her voice shaking. "You're talking like an apostate." That word, apostate, hit me like a physical blow. In our organization, it was the worst. Accusation possible, reserved for those who turned against God's truth, who became instruments of Satan, who deserved eternal destruction. To be called an apostate was to be marked for spiritual and social death. But instead of fear, I felt something unexpected: relief. "Maybe I am," I said quietly. "Maybe asking questions makes me an apostate. Maybe caring more about children's lives than organizational policies makes me an apostate. Maybe thinking that love should be bigger than rules makes me an apostate." Sarah was crying now, pressing her hands against her ears. "Please stop. Please just stop talking." I walked to the door, then turned back. "I'm going to tell people the truth about what happened to Eli. Not the sanitized version in the magazine, but the real truth about how a little boy died because grown men were more concerned with maintaining their authority than saving a child's life. Mary Ellen, if you do that, they'll disfellowship you. You'll lose everything: your friends, your identity, your hope of eternal life. Tom might even leave you." I looked at her one last time, this woman who had brought me into what I thought was the truth, who had become a sister to me, who was now choosing loyalty to an organization over friendship with someone who loved her. "Sarah," I said, "I've already lost everything that matters. I lost my conscience the day I stood in that hospital hallway and agreed that Eli should die every time I knocked on a door and told families that our organization was loving and protective. I lost my soul every time I watched people suffer for rules that Jesus would have condemned." I drove home through the cold February morning, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. By the time I reached my driveway, I knew exactly what I had to do. I walked into my house, sat down at this very kitchen table, and wrote a letter that would end my life as Mary Ellen Hartwell, faithful Jehovah's Witness, and begin my life as Mary Ellen Hartwell, woman with a functioning conscience. The letter was addressed to the local newspaper editor. It was 3 pages long, written in my careful handwriting, and it told the complete truth about Eli Bennett's death. I named no names, made no accusations that couldn't be proven, but I laid out exactly what had happened when a little boy needed blood to live, and grown men decided that doctrinal purity was more important than a child's life. I sealed the letter in an envelope, walked to my car, and drove to the post office. Standing at the mailbox with that letter in my hand, I knew I was about to lose my husband, my friends, my community, and my entire identity. I knew the organization would brand me an apostate, that faithful witnesses would cross the street to avoid me, that my name would become a warning tale about the dangers of independent thinking. I also knew that if I didn't mail that letter, I would never be able to look at myself in the mirror again. Dropped the letter into the slot and heard it fall with a soft thud that sounded like the end of one life and the beginning of another. The letter was published on a Thursday morning, 3 days after I mailed it. Tom found the newspaper on our front porch as usual, but when he came back inside, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. "Mary Ellen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what have you done?" I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing our breakfast dishes in water that had grown cold while I stared out the window at the bare February trees. I'd been expecting this moment for 3 days, rehearsing what I would say, but when it finally came, all my prepared words disappeared. I told the truth, I said simply, not turning around. The truth? His voice cracked. You attacked the organization in a public newspaper. You made us look like a cult, like we murder children. I dried my hands on the dish towel and finally faced him. Tom was holding the newspaper like it was contaminated, his face a mixture of hurt and horror and something that might have been fear. I didn't attack anyone, I said quietly. I just described what happened to Eli Bennett. I let people draw their own conclusions. You used our private religious beliefs to make us look like monsters. The words came out louder than he'd intended, and he glanced nervously toward the windows as if the neighbors might be listening. Mary Ellen, this will destroy us. The elders will have to take action. The congregation will... God, what will people think? That last question revealed everything I needed to know about where Tom's loyalties lay. Not, how could they let a child die? But what will people think? Within 2 hours, our phone started ringing. The first call was from Sister Ruth, her voice tight with something between concern and accusation. Mary Ellen, dear, I just heard about the newspaper article. Please tell me you had nothing to do with this attack on God's organization. When I confirmed that I had written the letter, the silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she said, I think you should speak with Brother Robert immediately. This kind of bitterness can destroy your relationship with Jehovah. The second call was from Brother Robert himself. His voice carried that calm authority I'd once found so reassuring, but now it sounded cold and calculating. Sister Hartwell, I think we need to have a conversation. Can you and Brother Hartwell come to the Kingdom Hall this evening at 7 o'clock? It wasn't really a request. That evening, Tom and I sat in the front row of the empty Kingdom Hall, facing 3 men in dark suits who had positioned themselves behind the small table on the platform. Brother Robert sat in the center, flanked by Brother David Clark and Brother Michael Torres. The same 3 men who had stood in the hospital hallway while Eli Bennett bled to death. Sister Hartwell, Brother Robert began, his voice echoing slightly. In the empty hall, you've caused considerable distress to our congregation with your letter to the newspaper. Several brothers and sisters have called expressing concern about your spiritual condition. I had prepared for this moment, but sitting there under those fluorescent lights, facing men who had once been my spiritual guides and teachers, I felt smaller than I'd expected. I don't understand the distress, I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I simply told the truth about what happened to a little boy. The truth? Brother David leaned forward slightly. Sister Hartwell, you presented a one-sided account designed to make the organization look callous and controlling. You failed to mention the scriptural basis for our position on blood. You failed to explain the hope of resurrection that comforts faithful families. You turned a beautiful example of faith into an attack on God's people. A beautiful example of faith? The words came out harsher than I intended. An 8-year-old boy died. There was nothing beautiful about it. Brother, Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. Sister Hartwell, are you questioning whether Eli's parents made the right decision? Are you suggesting they should have violated God's clear command about blood? The trap was perfectly laid. If I said yes, I was openly contradicting church doctrine. If I said no, I was admitting my letter was inappropriate. I looked at Tom, sitting beside me with his hands clenched in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. I looked at the 3 elders, waiting for my answer with the patience of men who had conducted many such interrogations. I looked around the Kingdom Hall where I'd spent countless hours listening to talks about love, truth, and integrity. I'm suggesting, I said carefully, that Jesus never asked anyone to let their children die to prove their faithfulness. I'm suggesting that love is supposed to be bigger than rules. I'm suggesting that if our doctrine leads to dead children, maybe we should examine our doctrine. The silence that followed was deafening. Brother Robert's face remained expressionless, but I saw him exchange a quick glance with the other 2 men. Sister Hartwell, he said finally, those are very serious accusations. You seem to be suggesting that the faithful and discreet slave, Class, appointed by Jesus himself to provide spiritual food, has given wrong guidance. Are you claiming to have better understanding of Scripture than the organization? Another trap. The organization taught that questioning their interpretations was the same as questioning God himself. I'm claiming the right to use the mind God gave me, I said. I'm claiming the right to read the Bible and think about what it actually says instead of just accepting what I'm told it says. Tom made a small sound beside me, something between a gasp and a groan. Brother Robert leaned back in his chair. Sister Hartwell, I'm afraid your attitude shows dangerous pride and independence. The Bible warns about those who become wise in their own eyes, who reject godly counsel in favor of their own understanding. He opened a leather-bound notebook and consulted it briefly. We've received reports that you've been asking inappropriate questions during field service, that you've been discussing doubts with other sisters, that you've been encouraging a critical spirit toward the organization's direction. The reports. Of course there had been reports. In our organization, loyalty was measured partly by willingness to inform on fellow members who showed signs of spiritual weakness or rebellion. Furthermore, Brother David added, your letter to the newspaper has already caused damage. We've had calls from concerned members of the community asking questions about our beliefs. You've brought reproach on Jehovah's name. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, but my voice surprisingly clear. Brothers, I said, I've sat in this hall for 15 years listening to talks about truth, love, and integrity. I've knocked on thousands of doors telling people that God is love, that his organization cares for people, that following Jesus brings peace and freedom. I paused, looking at each of their faces in turn. But God's love doesn't let children die for the sake of doctrine. A caring organization doesn't turn a mother's grief into magazine propaganda. Following Jesus doesn't require surrendering your ability to think and feel and question. Sister Hartwell, Brother Robert's voice carried a warning tone. You need to be very careful about the path you're choosing. Apostasy is a serious spiritual condition that can lead to eternal destruction. Then maybe, I said, walking toward the door. Eternal destruction is better than eternal compliance with something that kills children. I left them sitting there in that fluorescent-lit hall, left Tom to face their questions alone, left behind 15 years of identity and belonging and certainty. 3 days later, I received official notification that I was being disfellowshipped from the Congregation for Apostasy and Causing Divisions among the Brothers. The letter informed me that faithful witnesses would no longer be able to have any social contact with me, that my spiritual condition was dangerous to others, that my only hope for restoration lay in complete repentance and submission to the organization's authority. He took his clothes, Tom moved his tools, that same week, and a picture of us from our wedding day. He left behind our marriage, our friendship, and 15 years of shared faith. The silence in my house was deafening. No phone calls from concerned sisters, no visits from encouraging friends, no invitations to meetings or field service or social gatherings. I had become invisible to everyone who had mattered in my life. But for the first time in 15 years, when I looked in the mirror, I recognized the woman looking back at me. She was scared, she was alone, she was uncertain about the future, but she was honest. She was someone who cared more about children's lives than organizational loyalty. She was someone who would rather face uncertainty than live with the certainty that she was part of something that caused unnecessary suffering. And slowly, gradually, I began to understand that losing everything I thought I valued had given me back something I'd forgotten I possessed. My own conscience, my own voice, my own relationship with whatever God might exist beyond the walls of human organizations. The first year after my disfellowshipping was the hardest year of my life. I woke up each morning in a house that felt too quiet, made coffee for one instead of two, and faced days with no predetermined structure of meetings, field service, or organizational activities. For 15 years, the Watchtower had planned my weeks, my months, my entire life. Suddenly, I had to learn how to be Mary Ellen Hartwell without any external validation of who that person was supposed to be. The isolation was crushing at first. Walking through our small town became an exercise in public humiliation. Former friends would cross the street when they saw me coming, their faces carefully blank as if I'd become invisible. Sister Ruth, who had once spent hours at my kitchen, table planning our ministry work, now turned away when our paths crossed at the grocery store. The woman who had taught me to bake communion bread for our meetings pretended not to hear when I said hello in the library. But the hardest part wasn't losing the friendships. It was watching people I'd loved for years transform into strangers, who seemed genuinely afraid of me, as if my questions about doctrine were contagious, as if my decision to speak publicly about Eli's death might somehow infect them with dangerous thoughts. 3 months after the disfellowshipping, I received an unexpected phone call. A woman's voice, tentative but determined, said, "Mrs. Hartwell, my name is Carol Peterson. I read your letter in the newspaper, and I wanted to thank you." Carol had been raised as a Jehovah's Witness, but had left the organization in her 20s, after what she described as too many questions and not enough honest answers. She'd been living quietly in Nashville for 20 years, working as a librarian, maintaining minimal contact with the family members who still shunned her for her decision to leave. "I thought I was the only one," she said during our first coffee, meeting at a small cafe downtown. "I thought I was the only person who'd seen the contradictions, the control, the way they protect the organization's reputation more than they protect people." Through Carol, I discovered a quiet network of former Jehovah's Witnesses who had found various ways to rebuild their lives after leaving. Some had joined other churches, some had abandoned religion entirely, and others, like me, were still trying to figure out what they believed about God and faith and truth. We started meeting monthly in Carol's living room, never more than 8 or 10 people, but each carrying stories of lost families, abandoned dreams, and the slow, difficult work of constructing new identities outside the only community we'd ever known. We called ourselves the Questions Group because that's what had gotten most of us into trouble in the first place: the audacity to ask questions that didn't have approved answers. It was in that group that I met James, a gentle man in his early 50s who had been disfellowshipped 3 years earlier for what the elders called causing divisions, when he'd questioned the organization's handling of child abuse cases. He was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and carried himself with the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving something terrible and choosing to help others do the same. "The hardest part," James told our group one evening, "isn't losing the religion. It's learning to trust your own judgment again after years of being told that independent thinking is dangerous." Over the months, James and I began spending time together outside the group meetings. We'd take long walks along the Cumberland River, talking about everything we were learning to think about differently: morality without rule books, spirituality without organization, love without conditions. He understood the particular grief of losing not just a belief system, but an entire way of understanding reality. 2 years after my disfellowshipping, James and I were married in a small ceremony at Carol's house, surrounded by our chosen family of fellow questioners and truth seekers. It wasn't the wedding I'd imagined as a young witness woman. No kingdom hall, no elders giving counsel about submission and headship, no congregation of brothers and sisters celebrating our union. But it was honest, and it was ours, and it was based on love rather than organizational approval. Around the same time, I started receiving letters from people who had read about my story in various publications that had picked up the original newspaper article. Some were current Jehovah's Witnesses writing anonymously to express their own doubts and questions. Others were former members sharing their stories of loss and recovery. A few were parents from other high-control religious groups telling me about their own struggles with organizations that demanded obedience over conscience. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman in Oregon whose teenage daughter had committed suicide after being disfellowshipped for what the elders called moral uncleanness. The mother wrote, "Your courage to speak publicly about these issues gives me hope that maybe other families won't have to lose their children to religious extremism." Those letters led me to start speaking at conferences about religious trauma, sharing platforms with psychologists, sociologists, and other survivors of high-control groups. I discovered that the dynamics I'd experienced in the Watchtower organization, the demand for unquestioning obedience, the punishment of dissent, the isolation of questioners, were common features of many groups that claimed exclusive access to divine truth. In 1995, 7 years after my disfellowshipping, I received a phone call that I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Sarah's voice, older and wearier than I remembered, said simply, "Mary Ellen, I think I'm ready to talk." We met at a restaurant halfway between her new home in Kentucky and mine in Nashville. She looked fragile, older than her 42 years. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there during our last conversation, a spark of anger that had finally overcome the grief. "I left 6 months ago," she told me, stirring her coffee with hands that shook slightly. "It took me 7 years to admit that you were right, that Eli didn't have to die, that I was manipulated into making a choice that no loving God would ever ask of a mother." Sarah had remarried, a kind man who wasn't a witness, who had helped her see that her son's death wasn't noble sacrifice but preventable tragedy. She was in therapy, working through what she now recognized as religious trauma, learning to forgive herself for choices she'd made, while under psychological pressure she was only beginning to understand. "I want to do something," she said. "I want to help other parents avoid what happened to us. I want Eli's death to mean something by preventing other deaths." Together, we started a small foundation focused on providing information to parents facing medical decisions involving religious restrictions. We worked with doctors, lawyers, and child advocates to ensure that families had access to all their options, that children's welfare was prioritized over organizational policies, that no other 8-year-old would die because adults were more concerned with doctrinal purity than human life. Today, as I sit in this same kitchen where I first began to question everything I'd believed, I can see the bird feeder that James installed outside the window. Chickadees and cardinals visit throughout the day, and I've learned their different calls, their feeding patterns, their seasonal behaviors. It's a small pleasure that was forbidden during my years as a witness. We weren't supposed to take time for such worldly observations when there was so much preaching work to be done. I'm 68 years old now, and I've lived exactly half my life, inside the Watchtower organization and half outside it. The second half has been harder in many ways, lonelier, more uncertain, full of questions that don't have easy answers. But it's been mine in a way the first half never was. I still believe in God, though not the angry, demanding God of my witness years. I believe in love, though not the conditional love that depends on organizational loyalty. I believe in truth, though not the kind that comes with a trademark and a publishing corporation behind it. Most importantly, I believe in the courage to ask questions, even when the answers might cost everything you think you value. Because sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted gives you back everything you actually need: your conscience, your voice, your ability to choose love over rules, compassion over compliance. You're struggling with similar questions, whether about Jehovah's Witnesses or any other organization that demands your conscience in exchange for belonging. Know that you're not alone. Know that questioning doesn't make you wicked or weak or spiritually sick. Know that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is refuse to let anyone else do your thinking for you. And if you're a parent facing impossible choices between religious rules and your children's welfare, please remember that no loving God would ask you to sacrifice your child's life to prove your devotion. Love protects, love preserves, love chooses life whenever possible. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel. Thank you for listening to this old woman's journey from unquestioning faith to questioning love. Thank you for allowing me to honor Eli's memory by speaking the truth that might protect other children. And thank you for reminding me that stories shared in love have the power to heal not just the teller, but everyone who listens with an open heart.